Thank you so much for all coming to hear about my paper, and thanks for the invitation to present. Looking forward to your comments. And just to be clear, I have 40 minutes, and then there's discussion and questions afterwards to make sure I'm correct on time. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, William.
Okay, great. Sorry. Okay, so this is racial differences in the total rate of return on owner-occupied housing with Rebecca Diamond, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts on the paper. So the broad motivation, at least within the US, which I guess you're a UK institution, but broadly, maybe this has been a conversation around the world, has been trying to think about how wealth inequality, sometimes in the US we frame it more in racial terms, but I think this inequality issue is fairly universal, of how getting onto the housing ladder, buying your first house, is really important for accumulating wealth. So if we quote people from both political parties in the United States, we can talk about how you've been locked out of the ability to build wealth if you don't get into your first home and become a homeowner and allow it to appreciate. And there's also been some pushes, even from the Republican Party at times, to try to increase homeownership amongst minorities, Black and Hispanics primarily in the US, and thinking of this being a way of mitigating racial wealth gaps. You could frame this, even just in pure class rather than race terms as well, but I think one of the main public policies people thought about for trying to lead to wealth accumulation, particularly at the lower end of the market, has been getting people onto the housing ladder so that they have a tangible asset which can appreciate over time. Now, I guess if this is something which you might consider as a policy, one of the first order things you are interested in is what kind of a rate of return are people going to get? If we think back within the US, one of the classic examples where this might or might not have worked out so great was with the 2008 financial crisis. A large number of homeowners who had gotten subprime mortgages disproportionately were foreclosed on, and that may be pushed against this idea that, owning a home is a way to build housing wealth over time. So because of that, trying to understand whether getting people into a home is actually a good investment for them is a question that we need to know the answer to if we want to understand whether this idea of getting on the housing ladder is something which leads to wealth accumulation. And this is particularly true if we're thinking about this racial inequality frame in which we sort of organize the results in this paper. Housing wealth is both the largest component of wealth overall. So I would overall describe the wealth distribution as there's some very rich people at the top with a lot of stocks and a lot of private businesses, but a broad notion of the middle class, maybe going from like the 30th to the 70th percentile of the wealth distribution in the US. Basically, people's balance sheet looks like a home, a mortgage, and maybe somewhat of a retirement account. And this concentration of wealth in housing is actually disproportionately true for minority homeowners in the US. So about 2/3 of their wealth is in their house. But at the same time, their homeownership rate is actually somewhat lower. So Black homeownership rates in the US have been about 45% over the last few decades, with the overall one bouncing more around 2/3. And then I guess there's this question of if public policy could increase that homeownership rate, would that be good or bad for inequality? And this paper is going to answer a sort of intermediate question that leads to helping to understand this, which is just from a pure measurement perspective, what is the rate of return on being a homeowner? How does it differ across racial or ethnic groups? And can we possibly explain why these differences occur? So based on this broad motivation, I'm zooming into a very specific and somewhat narrow question, which is what is the rate of return that homeowners are getting when they buy a home and live there over time? And then trying to understand racial differences in this rate of return, and in some sense, trying to get towards why do we see the differences that we do. So that's the question. Now let me tell you about how we try to answer it. We are going to measure property level rates of return in our main data set from a nationally representative stock of housing in the United States from 1974 to 2021. The data set that provides this is called the American Housing Survey. It turns out it's a public data set. We do a little bit of robustness with proprietary data, but the benchmark results on this paper are all entirely from data you can just click download on for free. But what this data set provides, which is sort of uniquely good, is its panel data on individual houses over time, including the residents who live there, and characteristics both of the residence and the house itself. So if you want to know numbers of bedrooms and bathrooms, that's one thing. It will tell you, even when the house is not transacting, a survey response of what they think the house is worth. And then particularly for this racial inequality framing that we're interested in, the housing survey directly reports the race of the homeowner because they just report it in the survey. This is something often that gets imputed with fancy machine learning algorithms, which may or may not work in other papers that look on racial inequality here. So with this data, we need to do some new things to measure important pieces of the rate of return as well. And one of the key components of living in a house, I hope this is not shocking, is that you actually get the consumption value of living there, and you otherwise might have had to rent that house in order to acquire that consumption value. Now, because you don't pay yourself a check from your left pocket to your right pocket as a schizophrenic combo of landlord plus tenant, we don't have data directly on the rental value of owner-occupied housing. And I guess because you guys are a government statistics related group, you might run into this issue if you're thinking about inflation measurement, where the value of owner-occupied housing in consumption terms is a first order thing. For US inflation statistics, this is one of the biggest components of it, and the measurement there is kind of, has a lot of judgment calls to do. But beyond this, we also have a few things directly in the data. So maintenance and property taxes are directly in our data set. And then we validate our results here. So maybe you don't like our survey data. You think surveys are subjective and the person doesn't know what the value of their house is. We use some data with actual transaction prices and actual rents from CoreLogic, which is a large data set of more recent transactions and postings of houses in the United States. So it's all true administrative data of buys and sells and rents that actually occurred. And we get broadly the same results as we find here from our survey data. So this sort of fits within two literatures. There's a big literature on racial disparities in housing returns. As a one-sentence summary in terms of our finding, many of these other papers are saying that Black and Hispanic homeowners have lower rates of return than white homeowners. This paper is saying that Black and Hispanic homeowners have higher rates of return than white homeowners. So how could this possibly be? A positive number can't equal a negative number. And hopefully towards the end of my presentation, I'll be able to explain part of why that's true. Part of it is the way that we're imputing rent here, we think is a methodological innovation. Part of it also is if you think carefully about what the rate of return on housing is, you will get a different answer from a more natural notion that we think we're using relative to some of the definitions that people have in the literature. As a one-sentence summary, if you buy a house and you stay there over time, that unsold house should be included in an overall notion of rate of return because people might stay there for decades. And people have looked only at what I would call a completed housing spell, where you see a sale in sample. And when you look at that selected subset of the data, the impact of foreclosures on the rate of return is much larger, and that actually can flip some results. But if you look at an overall rate of return, including both sold and unsold houses, which if you were measuring, say, the return on stock market investments is always what you would naturally do because you just see the price. People don't select on buying and selling to look at a subset of the data there. So when the data is available, that's what we do. And when you define the rate of return, the natural way that it's done sort of more broadly in other literatures without these data limitations, then you get a notion of rate of return where Black and Hispanic homeowners have a higher return, not a lower one than white homeowners. From a methods perspective, then, our paper fits in this literature on just measuring the return on housing in general. And I would say there's, broadly speaking, two literatures we're related to here. One in particular, there's other papers that have tried to impute the rental value of owner-occupied housing using what are called a hedonic approach. So I regress rents on rental properties on square feet, number of bedrooms, things like that. And then I construct fitted values on owned properties just by plugging into that kind of regression. Now, you might think that an owned property with the same number of bedrooms, bathrooms, and square feet might be unobservably nicer. Maybe the architecture is nicer, maybe the location's better beyond the coarse location statistics that you already have. And what can help with us there is to look jointly at data on rents and prices on the same property, which is what we're going to do. There's a few papers I cite here which have looked at these rent to price ratios on individual properties just to measure the returns that, say, a landlord gets when you see directly data on them renting out properties that they own. What we're going to do is kind of combine these two literatures by looking at these joint rent to price ratios on properties where we see data on both, and then use that to develop a method to impute the rental value for all the owner-occupied properties too, where we're going to be able to use the house's transaction price to proxy for unobservable quality, which otherwise you wouldn't be able to use. Okay, so here is our data, the American Housing Survey. Benchmark goes from 1975 to 2021. We see repeated observations on the same house over time. And for our method of imputing rental yields, the fact that a house can switch between being owned and rented is crucial here. When it's owned, we see data on what they think the price of the house is. When it's rented, we see what their rent is. So for what we would call a switcher house, we have a joint distribution of these two things. So we see the reported value of the home if there's an owner, the rent of the home if there's a renter, the resident's race, regardless of whether it's an owner or a renter, property tax amounts, and maintenance expenditures. So this is a long time series, and there's a lot of rich survey variables here, not just the things I reported there, but characteristics of the resident too, which we're going to use later in the presentation. And it's the only data set we know that has race, property taxes, maintenance, and value, a panel of all this at a property level. And for our approach to measurement, we really need all that. So even though it's an easily available public data set, in some sense, it's actually perfect for the questions that we're trying to answer. Okay, so let's get into the methods of the paper. So we are trying to measure the total rate of return on housing. And just to quickly review, the return on an asset in general depends both on the cash flows that the asset produces and on the capital gains you get from the asset's price changing. Whether it's a stock or a house, you might get a dividend, you might get the fact that you could rent this out. So the cash value of living there, you can think of as if I rented this out, what would the market price be? And then in addition to that, the price can go up and down. And when we add these two terms together, that is the total rate of return on housing, the cash flows plus the appreciation of the underlying asset. So if a house is worth PT at time t and PT plus 1 at time t plus 1, we measure the log rate of return as the log of tomorrow's price minus the log of today's price minus all of the cash flows today. The reason why we do it this way is this timing convention, having the cash flows with today's price, means that there's a lot less missing data. And what we're going to have here is, if I click, data on prices directly reported in our data set, data on taxes and maintenance directly reported in our data set, and the one missing piece is the rental yield. And this isn't just not even reported in our data set. This in some sense doesn't directly exist because you don't take money from your left pocket to write yourself a check into your right pocket as your own landlord when you're an owner occupant. So this isn't directly observed, and we're going to develop a new method to infer it. We also have a little side piece we wrote for the papers and proceedings where we use this method to look at housing affordability in terms of what is the consumption value of owner-occupied housing across space. Happy to talk about that offline. And we're also starting a new project trying to think about if you measured rental yields our way, what would that do to change inflation statistics in the United States too? That's still work in progress, no results yet, but we think that this might be a useful measure for those types of questions as well. Here's our raw data. We've got summary statistics about the value of Black, white, and Hispanic homeowners' property, routine maintenance, home improvement, and property taxes. So Hispanic and white homeowners in this data set have an average house price of about $240,000. Black homeowners is a lower $170,000. Roughly similar amounts of routine maintenance across groups. And what this leads to is a higher maintenance rate for lower price houses in general. So the fraction of the house value spent on maintenance is a bit higher for Black homeowners. You can also see for the home improvement, the mean of these is far higher than the median, and the standard deviation is quite large. Basically, what's going on here is beyond sort of making sure that your sink is working and the electricity is running. The home improvement has, do you add a bedroom to your house? Something like that. And that's something which you rarely do. But when you do it, it's going to be a big expenditure. So because we have both of these, we have a pretty broad notion of the cash flows spent on both upkeep and improvement of a home. And if you want to get the right notion of rate of return on housing, you need a broad perspective of all of the cash flows that the homeowner is actually paying. So that makes this data set great for this application. Last thing we have here is property taxes, which are ballpark proportional to the value of your home. They are higher for white homeowners than Black homeowners, roughly in proportion to the higher property value as well. And similarly, Hispanic homeowners, similar average price as white homeowners, and similar property taxes as well. Okay, so that is the raw data. Now let me tell you how we impute the unobservable part, which is the rental value of owner-occupied housing. Here we are going to use data both on rents and prices of the same home. because our data set has these switcher houses, which are sometimes rented and sometimes owner occupied, giving us an observation on each. So we're going to start with a broad conceptual framework where a house has both observable and unobservable characteristics that determine how nice of a place it is to live. And we're going to say that your rent and your price would be determined by this entire list of everything that is observable in the data, plus some list of unobservables, which also might determine the quality of living there. The first assumption we're going to make is a single index assumption. This is the crucial thing that allows you to use rents and prices jointly to solve for this unobservable quality problem, which is that there is a single one-dimensional notion of home quality, which beyond the observables affects rents and affects prices. So if you wanted to falsify this, the kind of thing you have to worry about is not that unobservables do or don't exist in the first place, but that they differ for rents versus prices. So for example, if you think that renters like being around the best coffee shops and owners like being around the best school districts, then maybe they value unobservable quality in slightly different ways if those aren't in your data set. The issue isn't quite that bad because it would be renters and owners of the same property. If you rented a single family home in a place with a good school and bad coffee, probably your preferences are not so different from the homeowners, but it's that kind of relative difference in preferences across the two markets is the sort of thing that would break our assumption. At least I would argue that by accounting for unobservables at all, which should be mostly common between the two, we're doing significantly better than relying just on the observables. Once you have this, then I could invert this price function and say that the unobservable one-dimensional quality is a function of observables and price. And then I can plug that into the other function. So I can say that if there's this single index, a one-dimensional unobservable quality of good versus bad for a house beyond everything that we see, you can then write the rental value of a house as a function of all of its observable characteristics and the price. So an old school hedonic regression for predicting rent would regress rent on bedrooms and square feet. We're saying regress on bedrooms, square feet, and the most recent transaction price. And that's going to soak up a bunch of unobservable quality index about the house, which is not reflected in the small number of characteristics you might actually see in a data set. Okay, so ideally that's what we would want to do. The one small issue we have is that we have our rents and prices seen at different points in time. And it's also the case that rent to price ratios vary over time too. So if I pool data across all of this across different years, in years when interest rates are high, rent to price ratios tend to be high too. And there's been a downward trend in interest rates since the 1980s. So what we're going to do here is convert to ranks. So for every year, I compute the quantile of your rent in the marginal distribution of that year's rented properties. And I do the same thing of the quantile of price for your marginal distribution of owned properties then. Once we've done that in the data, this looks like a much more stable relationship of your rent rank and your price rank over time. So then I'm going to regress my rent rank on observables and my price rank within the overall marginal distribution of each from that year. So these distributions vary over time, but this relationship between these quantiles we are going to assume is time invariant, and that's going to allow us to pool our data across the long time series that we have, allowing for much higher statistical power. So here's what we have. We have rent rank and price rank data in every year, house I at time t, rent R, price P. And then for these switchers where we have data on both, we are going to regress the rent on the price rank squared because it seems to fit a bit better, some various location type fixed effects, and a list of observable characteristics. We're going to run this regression separately for each racial group of homeowners. You might think that despite my argument I just gave you, that there's still some unobservable quality differences that in the true model of the world, this doesn't perfectly soak up. At least this way we get things right on average by breaking things into groups. And then once you have this, we are going to use your predicted rent rank, plug it back in to the marginal distribution of rents of the year where we're constructing fitted values, and from that get a dollar monetary quantity of rent predicted by this. Now, one thing I'm doing here, just to be clear, is that I'm running a regression and then plugging the fitted values into a nonlinear function. If I did an OLS regression here, that would be not acceptable. If we run a median regression here, which is what we do, we then get a valid median biased unbiased prediction of the rent of each house at each point in time. We're going to control for MSA year fixed effects. MSA is a US geographical unit, which is roughly the same size as a county, maybe a little bit smaller. And then characteristics of the home, such as age, square feet, number of bedrooms, and so on. Okay, so here's a little bit of evidence in favor of this stability argument that I made. So what I want to argue is that the joint distribution between rent quantiles and price quantiles over time doesn't change very much. The relationship between dollar rent and dollar price, you can see this downward trend in these red lines here. So year by year, I ran a univariate regression between those. And that seems to move down as interest rates fell over the 1980s. Whereas the rank on rank regression is the coefficient is the blue dots. Those are pretty flat over time. So obviously no statistical assumption is ever perfect, but the data is suggesting that this is a relatively decent way to pool data over time to increase our statistical power because the blue dots here are pretty constant, suggesting that this is a relatively stable relationship over time. Okay. I want to compare our rental methods here to what are called hedonic approaches. This is where you predict rents without using this price to proxy for unobservable. So you just regress on square feet, number of bedrooms, and so on. And these are going to be biased based on high and low price homes. If high price homes are unobservably high quality, you're going to get an underestimate of their rental yield. If low price homes are unobservably low quality, hedonics will give an overestimate of their rental yields. Let me show you that in the data. So the green lines here is the raw switcher data that we plugged in. The hedonic regression is in blue. It overpredicts for the low price houses and significantly underpredicts for the high price houses. And our quantile-based approach that I just showed you, nothing's perfect, of course, but it broadly tracks the green raw data across the price distribution. And if we're interested in inequality in rates of returns, we need to accurately measure the rate of return across the distribution here. So this is really important for the practical question of this racial inequality measurement that we're interested in. Here is a time series of rent to price ratios over time. There's a big common trend for everybody. It goes down into the 1980s as interest rates are getting to a peak. It goes up afterwards. The house price crash around 2009. Rental yields go way down as it booms and then way up in the crash afterwards. So that's the time series variation, pretty common across groups. But you can notice that the black rent price ratio is persistently the highest. The white one tends to generally be the lowest. And the Hispanic one, during booms, it approaches the black one of a very high rental yield. During some of the busts, it even overshoots the white one. So Hispanics have higher rental yields on average than whites. Blacks have the highest rental yields, but Hispanic rental yields are actually very sensitive to the business cycle too. This happens for two reasons I'll get into. They live in places with more volatile housing markets disproportionately, and actually they also disproportionately work in the housing sector, which leads to this sort of double excess exposure to the housing market. Okay, maybe you don't believe fancy econometrics, so let me try to justify why these rental yields differ across racial groups a separate way. So the data set, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, directly asks homeowners, if somebody were to rent your house today, how much do you think it would be worth monthly, unfinished, and without utilities? So this is raw data on rents and prices, but it's all surveys. People probably think their house is worth too much, but this way, maybe you distrust econometrics, and this is raw data. Let me show you what you got here. These rental yields here are shifted up compared to what I showed you before, consistent with everybody liking their own homes too much. But you see the same common business cycle fluctuations, the same excess sensitivity of Hispanics to the business cycle, and the same relative ranking of black rental yields above Hispanic rental yields above white rental yields. Okay, so maybe you distrust the econometrics there, and you want to see that in raw data. This is justifying consistently that higher rental yields for minority homeowners is in the raw data here as well. Let's go the other way. Maybe you distrust my survey data and you think people are reporting nonsense about the value of the house. Here we're going to use our data from CoreLogic and MLS, which uses actual housing transactions and actual posted rents and advertised properties. And here again, what we're going to do is merge the rental data with the price data to again get these joint observations of rents and price. Here we have the downside that much of the literature does, that we need a machine learning algorithm to impute the race of homeowners from their names and where they live. But nevertheless, if we believe those things, then we can use raw transaction data to measure these rental yields here as well. And we're going to run a similar regression in the paper. We talk about the complete details, but the same kind of regression of rents on price on these houses where we see both jointly in order to improve on a hedonic regression. And here, because of data limitations, we only do it from 2007 to 2016. Let me compare this now to our results from the American Housing Survey, where we are regressing rental yields on an indicator function for Black, Hispanic, or white race of homeowners, which are part of either of those three. And you see in our raw results in column 1, we have Black homeowners have a 1.6% higher rental yield, Hispanics 40 basis points. That's with year fixed effects. That compares to column 5 of the American Housing Survey. 1.6 higher for Black here becomes 1.5, and 40 basis points becomes 20, so that's pretty close. Then we control for MSA fixed effects. So once we account for geography, we see that Hispanics have significantly higher rental yields. This is showing that the geographic clustering of them in the southwest of the US matters quite a bit. We throw an MSA cross year. It doesn't do very much. And then in the last column, what we do is we throw in zip cross year. But before I get there, let me just report that column 3 here has the same controls as column 6 for American Housing Survey data. And again, it's pretty close. We have 1.67% higher for Black homeowners relative to 1.5% for Black homeowners in the AHS, and 1% higher for Hispanic here versus 93 basis points here. So broadly different, consistent average differences in rental yields across racial groups. The last thing I want to say is we control for zip code cross year in the last column. Sometimes papers will aggregate things up to zip codes and say that we've gotten rid of all the heterogeneity at this point and look at local summary statistics. This divides our coefficients in roughly a third of it remaining. So 2/3 of the heterogeneity might be between zip codes here, but there's still some remaining heterogeneity within, with 1/3 of the rental yield difference left over, suggesting that if you can get access to microdata, it's better to use that when possible, because a good chunk of the heterogeneity is within zip codes, which are a very small geographic unit in the US. Okay. So now let me get to our raw results. So here is the summary statistics on the average housing return by racial group. We have, in real terms, a 6.5% average return for white homeowners, 7.2% for Black homeowners, and 7.9% for Hispanic homeowners. If you aggregate everything up, the average is 6.6%, which is only slightly above the white homeowner number just because of the relative composition of the data set. So we have a higher rate of return for Black and Hispanic homeowners than white. And if you also look at the standard deviation here, we have a more volatile rate of return for both Black and Hispanic homeowners than white homeowners as well, which I think is implicit in the literature here and there, but hasn't really been emphasized. So higher but more volatile returns for both Black and Hispanic homeowners than white is our benchmark result here. And this result that Black and Hispanic homeowners return is above white homeowners is inconsistent with a significant chunk of the literature. And hopefully I can convince you that our measurement approach makes sense and that these answers are the sort of benchmark you want to think of economically. Here's a little bit more summary statistics of how these rates of return vary over time. We see them going up during the housing boom, crash during the housing bust of 2008. Generally, they stay highest for Black and Hispanic homeowners relative to white, but you also see this pattern that Hispanic homeowners are getting the best returns during the housing boom, losing the most in the housing bust, and then recovering afterwards, that their capital gains on their housing is really quite volatile. Whereas the Black and Hispanic homeowners, the Black versus white homeowners, you just generally see Black returns kind of persistently above white returns and not this excess sensitivity to the business cycle. Now let me get into the question of why we see the differences that we do. So what I'm going to do is take our results of the measured rate of return for each homeowner over time, and I'm going to regress it on an indicator function for the race of the homeowner, Black, Hispanic versus white, and an increasing number of controls. So our first results in column 1 here with just year fixed effects, those are very close to just the sample mean differences in that table that I showed you. 70 basis points higher for Black, 1.2% higher for Hispanic relative to white. If we control for geography by year, this shrinks the gap for Hispanics a moderate amount, doesn't do very much to Black. If we do a control for demographics, this is things like age, number of kids, things like that, very little changes in our coefficients. And then the really important thing is if we control for the income and education of the homeowner, if anything, we slightly over-explain the entire result. And then finally, once we include units characteristics, square feet, number of bedrooms, etc., we account for the entire disparity here with coefficients which are effectively zero. So the first order thing to take away from this is what's really driving the differences is income and education, with lower income, lower education homeowners getting higher, not lower rates of return. So that we think in an accounting sense, none of this is causal inference, but just sort of summarizing the data. The racial disparities in rates of return are broadly explained by socioeconomic status. And if we compare low-income white homeowners to low-income black homeowners, if anything, this is saying the low-income white homeowners might get a slightly higher rate of return. By a very small amount, these coefficients are quite close to zero. But that's the first order explainer, socioeconomic status. Let me decompose our rates of return into pieces. If we just look at property values and didn't measure the total rate of return, we would have found that white homeowners have a slightly higher return than black homeowners. This is what we're missing is that rental yield component, which mattered so much more for the black homeowners. And this ability to impute the rental value of owner-occupied housing is really first order here. You can also see that the excess volatility for Black and Hispanic homeowners is primarily coming from a higher volatility of their property value, not the volatility of the cash flows of the maintenance and rental value and so on of the house. It's the fluctuations of the price. If I decompose these property values again, here there's basically no difference for white versus black in the first place. And for Hispanic homeowners versus white, we have higher appreciation. Once we control for geography, that basically goes away. This is telling us that the reason why we have these high volatile returns for Hispanic homeowners is they are clustered in regions of the country with high appreciation volatile housing markets like the Southwest and California and Texas and so on. Okay, if we then try to account for dividends, this is rental yield minus property tax minus appreciation. Here we get something pretty similar to our overall total rates of return. We start with higher dividend yields for Black and Hispanic homeowners, each of about 70 basis points. When you control for things, there's a small effect of geography here, if anything. But once you control for the income and the education of the homeowner, that gets wiped out entirely. So it's the fact that these lower end homes have higher rental yields. If you buy a $50,000 house, the ratio of that relative to the rent will be 10 to different than if you buy a $1 million house. And that fact is the sort of one-dimensional thing explaining, we would say, primarily these differences, that lower income homeowners cluster in lower valued homes. Lower valued homes have higher rental yields is what the data is telling us, and that leads to them having a higher rate of return. Here are the summary stats on rents. We find that black homeowners have a 1% higher rent than white homeowners, Hispanic homeowners almost 1%, that's 80 basis points. That's consistent with the results I just showed you on the overall dividends. If I look at maintenance, actually black homeowners have 40 basis points higher maintenance rate than white homeowners. This pushes against our results a little bit. So it's good that we have all of these different contributors to rates of return. And then for Hispanic homeowners, we have 20 basis points higher amounts of maintenance relative to price value compared to white homeowners. Okay, so that summarizes broadly our accounting of where these rate of return differences come from. It's primarily accounted for by the socioeconomic status of the homeowner. Lower socioeconomic status is associated with higher rate of return. And the primary thing pushing in that direction is that the rental yield on the houses that lower income homeowners buy tends to be higher than the rental yield on more expensive homes bought by higher income homeowners. Okay, here's property tax. There's like basically nothing going on here. The average property tax is 1.5% for all racial groups. There's a paper about racial differences in property taxes, which does stuff with lots and lots of fixed effects to zoom in on a very small subsample. We show we're consistent with their results, but in terms of aggregate rate of return differences, property tax are basically a sideshow that aren't really doing anything. Okay, so let me show you a couple more things now. So here is trying to account for the excess volatility or cyclicality of rates of return. So I showed you in those aggregate charts that minority homeowners not only get higher rates of return, but particularly for Hispanics have more volatile rates of return than white homeowners in terms of sensitivity to the business cycle. So in the first column, I'm regressing the homeowner's rate of return on an indicator function for race and an indicator for a recession interacted with this. So this is saying that outside of a recession, black homeowners have 80 basis points higher return than white. Hispanics have 2% higher relative to white. But when you look in a recession, you need to add these two coefficients up. We lose almost 70 basis points of that extra return of 80 that Black homeowners get. So even in a recession, Black homeowners do slightly better than white homeowners on rate of return, but it's significantly less so than overall. For Hispanic, we actually get significantly lower rates of return in recession. This is saying outside of a recession, Hispanics have a 2% higher return. In recessions, that's maybe a 1.3% lower rate of return than white homeowners. So there's excess sensitivity to the business cycle. If you go back to my raw standard deviations, I was saying that Black homeowners actually have pretty idiosyncratically volatile returns. Hispanic homeowners, they have a similar standard deviation as Black homeowners on an individual level, but it's driven much more by the business cycle. Once we control for geography, that minus 3% becomes minus 80 basis points. Again, this is saying that the clustering of where they live in the country explains why they're so sensitive to the business cycle. We control for demographics. That accounts for maybe a little bit more. Once we control for income and education, the overall return disparities are gone. And once we control for unit attributes at the end, these last two columns, basically everything is zero, except there's a slight excess volatility for Black homeowners. I think what's going on here is Black homeowners are more racially segregated from white homeowners relative to Hispanic. And there are some high income Black homeowners living in majority Black neighborhoods that tend to be lower income overall. And those homeowners, we think, experience the higher volatility that's associated with the cheaper homes in general, even though they tend to be higher income themselves. So once you control for lots of stuff, we can account primarily with geography for the Hispanic volatility difference. For Black homeowners, there's a little bit left over once we've accounted for everything, even though there wasn't that much excess volatility in the first place. Basically, none of it could be explained. This coefficient is constant across all columns, more or less. Okay, the last thing I want to do is relate our paper to opposite results in the literature. So the main benchmark paper we're in some sense competing with, although I want to say the authors have been very friendly to us and shared data to help us try to jointly reconcile where our differences are coming from, is this paper by Kermani and Wong. And they say a key reason why Black and Hispanic homeowners have lower rates of return than white homeowners is their excess sensitivity to foreclosures. They tend to foreclose more often, and they also tend to have larger foreclosure discounts. So they were kind enough to provide us with a probability of foreclosure and a time by race average foreclosure discount from their estimates. And let's just be really conservative here and act like our data set is missing all the impact of foreclosures entirely. What you can show then for our rate of return is if you just subtract this number of the probability of foreclosure times the log of 1 minus the foreclosure discount, that would then correct our numbers. So we have our baseline numbers here for average rates of return. If we add in this very conservative correction of assuming we missed the whole foreclosure discount, it brings our Black and Hispanic rates of return down relative to white homeowners, but not so much that we flip our result. We still have that Black and Hispanic homeowners have a higher return than white homeowners, which then begs the question of, well, why are we finding different benchmark results in their paper? And the key reason is our definition of rate of return. So first, let me quickly summarize here. The conservative assumption we just made here is that we are missing the foreclosure discount entirely in our paper. And we use Kermani and Wong's estimates of foreclosure discounts and showed if you subtract that off, we still maintain our baseline results. And the reason why I think primarily why we have different results in them is we include homes that do not transact. We have the rate of return on the entire housing stock period by period. And they just look at the returns on houses that actually buy and sell, plus some corrections. I want to be fair to them. They try to fill in some returns of untransacted houses. But the last thing I'm going to do is walk in our core logic data from rates of return on just transacted houses to some notion of the entire housing stock. For simplicity, we're just going to look at capital gains here. So if we look at homes that were purchased in 2000 to 2016 and then sold, the annualized price growth here averaged across all properties with each housing spell as one observation, which is the standard approach the literature uses, different from us here for measuring rates of return. We find that Black homeowners have a 10% lower property appreciation rate than white, Hispanic homeowners 5% lower. If we then include houses which are not sold in sample by imputing their value at the end of time, that minus 10% becomes minus 4%. This second column is comparable to the benchmark results of Kermani and Wong. If we then control for property by year fixed effects, the gaps shrink a little bit too. If we then use the fact that we have a larger time sample, we include houses from 1975 matching our American Housing Survey result, these differences shrink again. The next thing we do here is we include houses which by benchmark we always did in our paper, but the other paper which used mortgages to infer the race of the homeowner would drop is cash purchased homes. That shrinks things in general. Cash purchased homes are not going to get foreclosed on because there's no mortgage. And then we start weighting the rates of returns by tenure. So if you're there for a decade, you count for 10 times as much weight as if you're there for 1 year, which is how our one period rate of return would naturally weight the data. Things shrink again. We put in year by county fixed effects. And then finally, we include homes which were also not purchased in sample. And if you look in our paper, there's a very large number of homes which are either not bought in sample or not sold in sample, disproportionately for minority homeowners. By the end, we've gone down from a 10% disparity in appreciation rates for Black homeowners down to only 50 basis points. And this is similar to our results, which are trying to use the overall housing stock and measuring returns where 1 year counts for one observation rather than one housing spell. If you get foreclosed on, you probably got foreclosed on while your mortgage was still relatively big. People who stick around for decades tend to have paid their mortgages off. So that difference in weighting when what we're doing is just 1 year of return of a house homeowner living somewhere has equal weight as any other year is why we're getting higher rates of return for Black and Hispanic homeowners relative to white, because foreclosures matter a lot less in a data set, which includes the returns on properties which weren't sold. By definition, every foreclosed property gets sold, so that overweights the impact of foreclosures. So let me quickly conclude. Our paper tries to measure the total rate of return on housing investment. We have this new procedure for imputing the rental value of owner-occupied housing that accounts for unobservable quality differences. That method's accurate across the price distribution, which is important for our inequality application. Black and Hispanic homeowners have higher but more volatile rates of return than white homeowners, and that's accounted for primarily by socioeconomic status. We validate our results from the American Housing Survey and the Consumer Expenditure Survey and CoreLogic to find this disparity in rental yields is very consistent. And we show that once you account for the returns on untransacted properties in our CoreLogic data with raw transactions in it, it seems to be consistent with our results from the American Housing Survey, suggesting that if you define rate of return naturally, you get this result that Black and Hispanic homeowners have higher, not lower rates of return than white homeowners based on all of our measurement approach. Thanks so much for listening and looking forward to the discussion.
Sorry, John, it looks like we can't hear you. No, still can't hear you.
Shall I just go ahead then?
I can hear you.
Good. Okay. So let me just go ahead with the discussion here. So thank you very much for that, William. A really interesting paper, very thought-provoking, and one heck of a lot of detail to work through as a discussant. But I enjoyed going through it. Let me see if I can get this working. Yeah. So just a quick recap of what the paper shows. So it introduces an imputation method to find the rental value of owner-occupied housing. The method uses housing resale prices to capture unobservable housing quality. So that's a unique or novel contribution to the literature. It has this very policy relevant and somewhat perhaps surprising finding that Black and Hispanic homeowners earn higher average total returns than white homeowners, but they're more volatile. And the reason they're getting these average total returns higher than white homeowners is mainly due to having higher rental yields. That's their rent to price ratio. They do a lot of different tests on the data, and they find similar disparities in the rental yield across multiple data sources. Okay, and then they show that the different risks faced by Blacks and Hispanic homeowners due to the business cycle. And on average, racial disparities in the total return on owner-occupied housing reduce the racial wealth gap over time. And William, in the start, he talked about wealth accumulation as something that they're looking at these results to have something to say about. So it's a very nice, very thorough and important paper, very dense with ideas and results and some fascinating appendices as well. Okay, so some comments. So here's equation 1 from the paper. So this is the log financial return to owning a house. And so it's the price you get in period T plus 1 minus the log of the price you get in period T, where you've earned some rental income. So that lowers the price you paid for the house in period T. But you've got to pay some tax and some maintenance for having made that purchase of the house. Okay, so a key thing to note here is that there's no mortgage charge, only tax and maintenance. They're the only costs that you face when you buy a house. So what this is saying is that the paper is focused on the return to the housing asset, not the homeowner's equity or debt. So that's fine, except the paper is interested in how house ownership impacts on the wealth gap across different groups. So if Black and Hispanic homeowners, they could face higher mortgage rates due to credit constraints, lower wealth, or systematic discrimination. They would offset the higher rental yields and negatively impact on wealth accumulation. So that reduces a bit what can be said from just focusing on the financial return about wealth accumulation. There's also some pretty interesting summary statistics, data in general throughout the paper. This table just is a little bit different from the one that William presented. I'm not sure what's been changed, but pretty much similar, I think. In particular, the parts that I've highlighted there. So you see you've got white, Black, and Hispanic panels here, and you see that there's some routine maintenance and home improvement, and you see across white, Black, and Hispanic, they're not too dissimilar, the numbers there, the numbers in the circles. If you look at the means, if you look at the medians, for white, the home improvement is about 982, and for the Hispanics, it's 384. Now that seems a bit of a surprise given that the means are quite similar. If we look at the mean of the property value for whites and Hispanics, somewhat surprisingly, is very similar. And the median is as well, spookily similar. Yet, even though the median property values are the same, Hispanics, it's almost a third of what the whites are spending on home improvements. It seems like something very strange is happening there. Also to note that the median is much lower than the mean, so there's some big outliers in there, and you can also note the standard deviations are bigger than the means for each category here, white, Black, and Hispanic. So it suggests the data are very volatile, very dispersed, and there are probably some big outliers which are messing things around a bit. Okay, so some more comments. It's assumed that houses with the same observables have the same price and rent rank, even from different years. So it ignores differences in unobservables, which can change over years. And it's quite a bit surprising that this argument is made that you just use with houses with the same observables when a key focus in the proposed imputation method is to include unobservables. The rental yield imputation method, it only uses owner occupied houses. That I think this is right, but maybe I was misled in the way I was reading it, particularly around table 3.1, I think it was. But it looked like the switches were only those who are going from owner occupied to rental housing, but I may be wrong about that. Okay, page 12 says the rent prediction uses both households observables as well as unobservable quality proxied by its price and its potentially an improvement over hedonic prediction methods that use observables alone. Okay, so imputed rents for owner-occupied housing are estimated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and no reference is made to the official methods and estimates, and I would have thought that would be kind of a starting point, because the BEA, they use these hedonic prediction methods, and it would be useful to make a comparison with what the BEA does to make the argument that what's being done here is an improvement. So the BEA's imputed rent is they've got a gross rental value, same as in the current paper, and some expenses, but their expenses include mortgage interest as well as maintenance and taxes. There's also depreciation there that's kind of captured in the current paper by looking at the price differences between the periods. But mortgage interest is a difference here between what the BEA does and what the current paper does. Okay, and it's all publicly available information there on their price statistics, so it would be good, I think, to make some reference to that. And in one of the appendices in the paper, the ACS survey is used, and that's what the BEA has moved to from the AHS that the current paper also uses. So it would be good to look at, as I said, what the BEA does. It's as William pointed out, these housing services are big, they're important. The BEA says the value of housing services make up about 10% of overall GDP. So in 2020, so that's huge. So if William and his co-author have this new method and they're able to show that it does things in a way which would improve things for the BEA, improve things over the BEA method, then that would be good, because then perhaps the BEA could adopt this methodology and it could lead to improved estimates of US GDP. And that's all I've got. A really nice paper, extremely thorough, and well worth reading. Thank you, William.
Okay, fantastic. Am I live finally?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Sorry for the tech issues. A really interesting paper. I was going to say, here in London, I'm sure in other cities, this is a perennial topic at lunch, over email. This is like the major concern of many people, and including the government. And I wanted to add, I want to say thank you to Kevin for the fantastic discussion. In fact, you're right. We had a paper here at Queen Mary last term, and they looked at detailed mortgage data. But one of the things they found was that more educated households actually search more for better mortgage deals, aside from whatever, redlining or credit constraints. So in terms of the welfare analysis, there's probably a differential there also, which may claw back some of that difference, given the demographic differences we know about education. Now, Will, I want to congratulate you on also on this paper. I think one of the things that we're doing here at ESCoE in terms of measurement is one of the things that we're not great on economics is trying to think about the counterfactual imputation of things and putting that seriously into our analysis. Like any kind of model or things like that, usually we get really cool data, we grow so much about the precision of it, but then when it comes to the counterfactual, we just make some mathematical assumption and just kind of lob it in there and then take a flying guess. So the fact that also in your paper you do some validation exercises and that you show out a sample and in a way that we can understand with a simple estimation, not just a machine, learning algorithm, that we can understand, and in particular, you have the coefficient gamma 2, I believe, which tells us exactly this curvature, the relationship between the price rental ratio, and you can even quantify how that curvature looks like. These are all really fantastic contributions. So I wanted to open up the floor to any questions if we had any. Otherwise, I've got some of my own. Do we have any people out there in cyberspace? I'm a real person. I'm just recording, I swear. We have any more questions in the chat? Okay, looks like not. So one of the things actually I wanted to ask you, back to Kevin's point about the BE and imputing value, one of the things that you notice really strongly in London, because there's been such a huge asset price appreciation over the last 30 years, right? A lot of money has gone to the property market, it's become financialized.
And you have this incredible situation where you have people like black cabbies in London who bought a house in the say 1990 or something like that. And the imputed rental flow, like your paper would show, is huge. So these people live in much better housing than say like the people like, the young professionals. I'm going to call myself a young professional for the purpose of this discussion, come into London, and we have an income flow which is maybe twice theirs, but our housing utility flow is incredibly small. So have you any thoughts about what this might imply for consumer welfare, or for measuring inequality, or for these other this huge part of people's budget, and this part that we're not really taking into national accounts or thinking about policy with?
Yeah, I guess the return results in and of themselves don't quite get at that, but I think the data here does pretty well. One thing I didn't emphasize in our core logic data is we have an ability to track people's residences over time. So I can't tell if you drove a cab or not, but I can tell, does it sort of seem like different generations are picking up on disproportionate shares of the housing appreciation? And I think that's a pattern in the data, which we might zoom in on a little bit more. One of the things we got pushed on a bit in the paper in the review process is, well, most of your differences in rates of return compared to the literature is about this foreclosure discount, but your new method's on the rental side, this rental yield imputation. I think what we're going to try to do now is look at people's overall life cycles, where the fact that they buy and sell jointly kind of mitigates the exposure to the actual market price of the house. And I think there we're going to pick up on one, there's this sort of trend where certain generations got a lot more appreciation. And two, that if they got locked in there, they persistently have this idea of a higher rental yield. I don't have any results there yet, but that's very much on our to-do list. Can I say a couple things relative to Kevin's very nice discussion?
Fantastic.
Sure, yeah. I guess two things I wanted to clarify, just make sure that I think we're on the same page here. So my assumption about the relationship between unobservable quality being stable over time, I'm not assuming that an individual house can't have sort of any arbitrary unobservable quality there. What I'm assuming is that the joint distribution between your rank in the price distribution and your rank in the rent distribution, those aggregate distributions, are stable over time. So an individual house can have the unobservables mattering a lot, but what this allows me to do is run my regression of rent on price across a pooled time series, assuming that relationship is stable, even though for each individual house, it can be whatever it happens to be. And then I guess the separate thing, I totally agree that levered rates of return, including mortgages, are really important too. I'll say two things. One, just the mortgage interest rate data in the AHS is horrible. In the core logic data, it's also really not good too. So what people will often do is like a back of the envelope calculation where they give everybody the average mortgage interest rate. So these disparities there in mortgage costs are not measured. I guess another tricky thing there is, are differences in mortgage costs related to expected default costs or not? I think that's a whole separate complicated literature. At least in the US, there's some sort of affordable housing subsidies, which I tend to think push the mortgage costs for the lower income homeowners maybe below actually their sort of fair economic value to some degree, because of sort of subsidies from various government sources. And then the last thing is, if we're thinking about levered rates of return, you don't just want to think about the mortgage cost itself, but the amount of leverage you have. It's the return not on buying a house, but on your down payment. And I think associated with these higher interest rates that Black and Hispanic homeowners get is also a higher degree of leverage. So I think at least on average, that, if anything, pushes their rates of return up. Their exposure to the crashes gets far worse. And I think this particularly for Hispanic homeowners, they are often very highly levered. They've got the most asset exposure to the business cycle and the most leverage. So when things go well, they get rich, and when things go poorly, they take a very disproportionate share of the bust. But I think for at least the means, though, the leverage might even push towards higher rates of return for them, just because their down payments are small relative to house value.
That's fantastic. Do you have any more responses, Kevin?
I think Peter Lavelle has a question.
Oh, okay, can we go to Peter?
Great.
Yeah.
Hi, I can unmute and ask my question directly as well. I put something in the chat, but my question is about sort of the use. I think it's a really neat idea, the use of this switcher sample, the use of these rental ranks this is a very clever idea that I will steal and use in my own work. But the question is about so national statistical agencies have this problem of this lack of common support in the rental and owner sector. So there's a bunch of properties that might never enter the rental sector at any point. And so you're going to have to assume something about that, and you have to assume something about that the selection that might be common across races. So in terms of the properties they're in, and yeah, I just wondered if you had thoughts on that, and also for the national statisticians here, how would you think about this kind of problem of common support in this kind of setting?
Yeah, I agree that's a tricky issue, particularly at the very, very high end of the housing market. Some mansions just do not rent. I think our thoughts were, if we're looking for an average rate of return where each person counts as one observation and the mega mansions don't get disproportionately weighted, for our notion of weighting the data, I think the support problem is not so terrible, because even like a 95th percentile value house, a few of them tend to rent, and you have some data on their value. In the American Housing Survey data I'm using here, the sample size is not that big, but the CoreLogic data, where we just see like lots and lots of postings of individual houses and rents, we're truly like when you have lots of data there, you can have differences in the like quantities, which certainly are there, but as long as the support is there, as you say, and that I think goes out pretty far, then I think it's okay to maybe up to the top, all but the top few percent of houses. At the very, very top, I think there's sort of nothing you can do. You can take the parametric model that we have and extrapolate, as we do, but you always are going to be doing something like that. And I think the question of selection into those very, very high-end houses, the only thing I can say is you should try to ask the data a question which is not very sensitive to the unmeasured tail, because I think that's sort of an insurmountable problem of if you did rent out a mega mansion. I guess a related issue, which this is also something I don't really know how to answer, is lower end houses are more commoditized. If you've got something really fancy, you might have a favorite artist or something and make it like your house look like their style. That might be great for your consumption value, but not rent out very well. And this like consumer surplus that like housing as a consumption and an investment good beyond the rental value to somebody else who doesn't share your weird tastes, I think that's another notion of subjective rate of return that I think the data just can't help us with at all, but might be quite important, particularly at the high end.
So that kind of spoke to Honor's question. Honor, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I thank you for that. That was really insightful. Just a quick question about why you think lower value homes have higher rents proportionally from an economic standpoint.
Sure. I think I could answer that a couple different ways. One is, let's imagine a very simple model. Everything's frictionless, everything's priced consistently like the stock market or something. You might think that let's say there's a constant rate of return on all housing, which is an oversimplification of the data. But from that perspective, you would think that homes in declining areas would have higher rental yields. If appreciation is low, the cash flow yield should be high just to sort of equalize things. There's more to it than just that. But I think if you look geographically within the US, you'll find that like Silicon Valley, where all the tech innovations happening and growth is going to continue, tend to have very low rental yields. And somewhere like St. Louis, which used to be a huge railroad hub and is declining, tend to have very high rental yields despite having low prices. So if you're in a declining area, the fact that house prices are a forward-looking dynamic measure and rental yields are today, I think will sort of naturally give you that pattern. If you have sorting of lower income people into declining areas, which I think is the case, that's sort of what you would expect.
Thank you. That answers my question. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Well, do we have any more niggling questions? So we have crossed an hour, and I'm mindful of
I'm happy to stay as whatever works. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, a similar, I guess, a follow-up, and it's maybe something's probably not in your data set, but I also wonder to what extent there's kind of homophily within the rental market, right? So I definitely see that in London as neighborhoods switch over. You might have one, ethno-demographic group which tends to rent within the area, and then as that gentrifies to declines, that kind of shifts. But then, especially within the US, I imagine if it's small-time renters, they always have veto power and they have some kind of preference over who they're renting to or who they're willing to rent from. Do you have any thoughts on how that might be shaping the rental premiums across groups?
Yeah, I think this was something which particularly mattered in the US around like the 1960s civil rights era of when sort of segregation was being aggressively fought. You would have neighborhoods like sharply switch over time. And my sense was when there would be like new Black families moving into previously all white neighborhoods, they would get a very bad deal because there was just a constraint on housing supply. There's someone at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, Allison Schertzer, has some like historical papers looking at this. And I think in eras when you have these sort of large changes and there's some sort of social tension around it, the fact that certain landlords are only willing to rent to certain people can lead to like broad differences in the price of renting in the same place. I think right now there isn't so much like directly if you rented right here in the same apartment, you would get a different price. But there is like even in Philadelphia itself, where I currently am visiting, you see large racial disparities in who lives where, which are associated with rental yields. And then I guess there's a question of whose preferences are driving this. Is it that the landlords will only rent in certain ways? Is it that homeowners or residents have preferences? I think that's the kind of thing where the supply and demand side are all jointly interacting in a very complicated way. You probably need to estimate like a structural model to think about these kinds of questions and make a lot of assumptions, but I agree they're really interesting and important. And I think within the US, these times of like sharp changes in demographics in the 60s and 70s, you would see associated with sort of what looked like a non-market disparity in your race determining the rent you'd get charged on an apartment.
Okay, fascinating. That's great. Do we have anything else? Okay, well, I wanted to say also, it's a shame you couldn't be here in London. So King's College, where this ESCoE often hosts stuff, it's in Bush, expensive building built at the time.
Very cool.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, it's and then the BBC was in it, and then the government moved in and kind of trashed the place. It became a low rent haven, but now it's back to its former glory.
Nice, that's
so
great.
hopefully sometime you have a chance to come in London and join.
Yeah, I'd love to. London's a wonderful city. I'd love to be there anytime.
Sure thing. Okay, well, I want to thank ESCoE, and I thank Will for tuning in, especially Kevin for staying up so late to be with us here, and looking forward to an exciting talk next week.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the great discussion, Kevin.